Good morning, Bright City. How's everybody feeling? Yeah, we made it here through the hail and the snow. I got in my car. I was extremely confused. Well, good morning, guys. We're so happy you are here. If this is your first time with us, at Bright City, our hope is to help walk with you as you take your next step towards Christ. So just keep that in mind as we go through our announcements, as you sit through this time during the service, that all of this is in a light of our desire to see you take that next step towards Christ, whatever that looks like. If that's your first step or your 100th step. If you are new with us, if this is your first Sunday, second Sunday, or just want to kind of start getting connected, maybe you've been here a little while, one of the best ways you can do that is after the service, you're going to have this white tent that says next steps. There's a great way for you to get connected with someone, talk with a pastor, talk with a leader, just start kind of, again, beginning that process of learning about who we are, why we're here, and what we want to do in your life ultimately through the Lord. We really want to find a lot of ways for everyone to feel connected. So we're going to go through a couple of those now. So again, after you've maybe taken that first step of getting to know us, we want to lay out some really tangible ways for you to get connected and to serve. So one of those ways is giving. We believe that giving is a tangible way that we say, God, you are sufficient, you are primary. And so we want to invite you to do that. You're able to use this QR code up here for that. You can use that for getting connected if you don't want to come to that white tent, if you don't want to fill out the paper card. Another way that we like to invite you to get connected is through serving. So we believe that serving is a way that we as a church operate in this interconnected way through all of us using our gifts and our talents and our passions to both impact the church but also our community. So feel free to also use this QR code for that. If there's a way that you want to serve, we would love for you to come and do that with us. We believe that is one of the best ways to not only impact the church, but get connected, right? Build relationships with people who have the same heart as you do. I want to give a quick shout out to our outreach team, Dorothy Coppett. Let's give them a round of applause real quick. Dorothy if you don't know Dorothy, she is awesome and just a gift to every single person she has ever even looked at. And we want to invite you that if you have interest in being uniquely connected to our community, finding strategic ways to serve, whether it be, in our schools, in our just day-to-day lives, here in the mall. I know Dorothy's constantly finding ways along with her team to do that. So we want to invite you to do that. You can fill out the QR code as well. There's links to get connected. Again, want to just give them a plug because they do a great job and we want people to be part of that team if they want to be. So a few kind of things about staying up to date. So we have lots of things going on here all the time. Okay, there's constantly some event or program. We want to make sure people feel connected. A great way to keep up with that, though, without having to listen to me every Sunday, is go sign up for the newsletter. You can do that on the QR code. Sign up on social media if you're not following us. This is not to get more followers. This is so that you know where things are going on. We want to try to create communication space to keep you connected. But a couple of announcements in particular for today. We have pizza with the pastors. So if you have not attended that, this is a great opportunity to connect with the pastors, to find opportunities to have those conversations. Maybe you feel like you haven't had, get some free pizza. It's a win on every level. I know Ike and Alex and Sharon love that time. So that'll be right after the service over at California Pizza Kitchen. So feel free after the service, just head over there, avoid the rain and hail and get in there. And then also this afternoon, right after the service, we have our high school lunch. So any high school students who have interest in getting connected with other high school students, getting connected with the leadership, they're going to be meeting at the food court here at South Point Mall after the service. So if you are new in any way and you want to get to know the pastors, head over to California Pizza Kitchen. If you're a high school student and you want to get connected with other high school students, head over to the food court. So I think that touches on everything we're going to touch on this morning. I want to invite Jonathan up to come and read the word for us, and excited for this time together.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Gay. I have the pleasure of serving on the liturgical team. And as such, if you're able, would you please stand for the reading of God's word? Today's scripture reading comes from Exodus, the 14th chapter, verses 5 through 14. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people and said, "What have we done? We have released Israel from serving us." So he got his chariot ready and took his troops with him. He took 600 of his best chariots and all of the rest of the chariots of Egypt, with officers in each one. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh of Egypt, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out defiantly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them and caught up with them at their camp by the sea, beside Pi-hahiroth, in front of Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming for them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to have served the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You must be quiet." This is the Lord of the, goodness gracious, this is the word of the Lord.
Jonathan, you guys can be seated. Well, the mid-2000s critically acclaimed movie Click is about a man who is played by Adam Sandler, and as you watch the movie, you quickly discover that his whole life is oriented around his career. At the beginning of the movie, he has 2 small children, he is married, and as the story unfolds, you quickly discover that every time he has a choice between advancing his career or putting his work first and anything else, whether it's time with his kids or intimacy with his wife or even being present on family vacations, he always chooses his career. Well, one night he is on a trip to Bed Bath & Beyond and ends up in a section of the store called Way Beyond. And in this section of the store, he runs into a character played by Christopher Walken, kind of this kooky guy, and he has something that he gives to Adam Sandler's character. It is a special TV remote. And this TV remote is special because he can actually use it to control his life. What I mean by that is he can fast forward to parts of his life that he wants to get to, like a promotion. He can fast forward through parts that he wants to avoid, like the bedtime routine with the kids, or if he gets sick, he can fast forward to when he is feeling well, or he can fast forward through a stressful work project. But before he knows it, he has fast forwarded to the end of his life. And we see at the end of his life, he is incredibly successful. He is the CEO of his company that is doing extremely well. He is incredibly wealthy and affluent. But he and his wife are also divorced. They've gone through a devastating divorce. His kids cannot stand him, and he is in awful physical health. You could say that throughout this movie, he has worshiped his career at the cost of everything else. And I don't want to spoil this phenomenal movie for you, but he discovers that he has oriented his entire life around the wrong thing. And it has turned out very differently than he envisioned that it would. And so as you're watching this movie, it leaves you wondering, is my life oriented around the wrong thing? If I could fast forward the trajectory of my life, would it end up like I want it to? Would I like where it ended? This morning, we are in the final movement of this series on the Sabbath. And over this series, we have looked at 4 different meanings or nuances of this word Shabbat. We've looked at the meaning of it to stop, to rest. Last week, we looked at delighting, and this week we come to the 4th meaning, which is worship. And as much as Sabbath is a day of delight and pleasure, like we talked about last week, a day to delight, there's a temptation that it can just become about delight and pleasure, a day of enjoyment. But that is not the ultimate point of this day. The ultimate point of this day is a day set apart for worship. Now, many of us come in here with our particular ideas of what worship is and what we think of when we think of worship. We may think of singing songs together. We may think of raising our hands. We may think of listening to a message. But worship is one of those words that has a much broader meaning that we can do in all kinds of areas of our life, such as Adam Sandler's character in this movie with his job. And so the definition of worship that I want to give you this morning that we're going to work with is to worship something is to make it the orienting factor of your life. To worship something is to entirely orient your life around that thing. The orienting factor of Adam Sandler's character is his career. What does it mean to be an orienting factor? One of the easiest ways to think about this is if you think about our solar system, the sun is the orienting factor of our solar system. Its gravitational pull and our distance from the sun determines the length of our year. The sun determines the temperature of our planet. Our orientation to the sun determines the season that we are in. On a smaller level, plants and trees grow in whichever direction gets the most sun. If you pull into our neighborhood, there is a house kind of right on the left that has this massive tree that's essentially growing sideways because it's trying to stretch out into the sun. An interesting thing to think about is how, this is kind of a no-brainer, but the bright side of our planet is always facing the sun. You're kind of like, duh, that's the way it works. But it's kind of like two people, a couple that is dancing face to face that are oriented towards one another. It's like the earth never takes its eye off the sun. It is oriented towards the sun. And so like the sun and like Adam Sandler's character's career, what we orient our life around will be the most determinative thing about everything else in our life. That is what it means to worship. That everything else in my life will conform to this thing's determination of my life. Throughout this series, we have looked in depth at the relationship between Israel's exodus from Egypt and the practice of Sabbath. And this morning, I want us to take one more look at that because one of the reasons God longs for Israel to be free is because Pharaoh had become the orienting factor of the Israelites' lives, and they were in brutal suffering because of it. This is why God sends Moses to tell Pharaoh to set them free. In Exodus chapter 4, God has called Moses to go to Pharaoh and to declare, him to let his people go free. And so in verse 21, it picks up of Exodus 4, the Lord instructed Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure you do before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put within your power. But I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. And you'll say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. In another place, Exodus 7, verse 16, again, it's telling him what the Lord told him to say. It says, tell him, the Lord, the God of Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. In other words, God has sent Moses to inform Pharaoh that Pharaoh will no longer be the orienting factor of God's people's lives. That what Pharaoh says about them will no longer be the most important thing about them. That Pharaoh's demands will no longer be the highest priority. That Pharaoh's threats are now empty because there is now one whose words carry more weight, whose instructions take precedent, whose protection renders impotent all other threats. There is a new orienting factor for their existence, and his name is Yahweh. The name that God gives Moses when Moses asks who sent him. His name means I am, and he's saying, I am your provision. I am your security. I am your peace. I am your purpose. I am your satisfaction. I am your delight. I am the orienting factor of your existence. And so with this definition of worship, the fact is we all worship something. We all have something that we have oriented our lives around, whether we recognize it or not. And we've oriented our lives around it because it has promised us something in exchange for our worship. And so the question is not whether we will worship something. The question is what we will worship. We have oriented our lives around these things because they have promised us things like security and peace and satisfaction and delight and provision. And so we all have oriented our lives around something. David Foster Wallace puts it this way in kind of a lengthy quote, but I think he gets the heart of this. He says, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, and always on the verge of being found out, and so on." The way John Mark Comer puts this, he says, "Nothing else can bear up under the weight of our worship." And so the invitation of Sabbath is to let go of the current orienting factor of your life so that you can go and worship the one who does bear up under the weight of our worship. This is what God tells Moses to go and tell Pharaoh, to let my people so they can go and worship me in the wilderness. So this verse is going to be sort of the structure of this message this morning. And the first part is to let my people go. The invitation here is to determine what is the orienting factor of my life. Many of us, if not all of us, have orienting factors dictating the steps of our lives. It could be a career, it could be a boss, it could be expectations from those around us that have been placed on us. It can be ideas of success, it can be fears of failure, fears about the future. The list is endless. But to be free of it, we first have to be aware of what it is that we have oriented our lives around that is actually inflicting bondage on us, that's keeping us trapped, that's keeping us from actually experiencing the things that we think it's going to give us. And so some helpful questions in determining what is that orienting factor in my life. There may be questions like, what do you find yourself worrying about most often? Where is it that your mind goes to when it's not preoccupied with other things? Where do you find yourself worrying? Because typically the things we worry about are the things that we depend on for some sense of security, for provision, for peace. What are the things that you're most insecure about? We're most insecure about them because we depend on them for a level of security. It provides us something, and we fear if we lack that, then it's going to affect our well-being. We're putting trust in that, and so our insecurity comes from, if I don't have this, I'm not going to be okay. What is the thing that we are always looking for a little more time to do or to work on? Because we believe if I have more of this, if I can do more of this, then I will have more security from it, more provision from it, more peace from it, more satisfaction from it. We have to discern what is it that I've oriented my life around before we can take the step of discovering how to change what our lives are oriented around. And so the first part is to understand that God is inviting us to be free of these orienting factors. The second part of this is let my people go so they may worship me. So we discover what it is our lives are oriented around, and then we do the work to reorient our lives around God. I want to dive into something that may be a bit heady, theological, philosophical for a moment, so stick with me here. But the German theologian Paul Tillich described God as, quote, the ground of being. He was saying that God was not merely one among other beings, but he was the very power of being that made the existence of all other beings, ourselves included, possible. His point in this was to say that the very question of the existence of God misunderstands God's nature. God does not exist like other things. God is the power by which all other things exist. If that was confusing, my point here is simply to say that there is nothing more real than God. And so the day of Sabbath is a day each week set apart for deepening our connection with the deepest reality there is. That is what it means to worship God, to deepen our connection with the deepest reality there is, to orient our lives around the deepest reality there is. And so it's not just a day of hedonistic pleasure, but a day to delight in our life's orientation around that deepest reality. A day to delight in our worship of Yahweh. And the good news here is that is a type of delight that is virtually indistinguishable from worship. That we so delight in connecting with God that it becomes a form of worship. This is the type of taste of heaven that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. But I think one of the great indications that we don't fully understand the beauty of the Sabbath is that we struggle to etch out even one day of Sabbath a week, to make it such a priority that we can commit to it for 24 hours. But if we really understood the rest, delight, worship of Sabbath, we'd ask why we can't have 6 days of Sabbath and 1 day of work. We would relish the taste of Sabbath, the intimacy of God's presence, the fullness of the peace that we find with Him, the sense of security we experience in His presence. And so worship is coming to understand that there is nothing more fundamental to our being and well-being than God, and responding by orienting our whole lives around Him. Rabbi Abraham Heschel put it this way. He said, unless one learns how to relish the taste of Sabbath while still in this world, unless one is initiated into the appreciation of eternal life, one will be unable to enjoy the taste of eternity in the world to come. The essence of the world to come is Sabbath eternal, and the seventh day in time is an example of eternity. And so we worship God when we come to understand that He is most fundamental to our being and well-being. And we reorient our lives around Him. But there's one more piece to this. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says that God has sent him to say, let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. This is by far the hardest part. The wilderness is the unknown place. When Israel went to orient its life around Yahweh, it had to do that in the wilderness. It had to go out into the unknown. They could not orient their life around God while they were still in Egypt because they had their lives already oriented around Pharaoh there. They couldn't orient life around Pharaoh and Yahweh. That's like the earth trying to orient itself around two competing suns. They could only orient themselves around Yahweh in the wilderness where they didn't know what they would eat or what they would drink, where they would sleep or whether they would be safe. They had to go out into the unknown away from every sort of security and assurance they'd grown accustomed to because those assurances, that security depended on orientation around Pharaoh. And orientation around Pharaoh entailed this dehumanizing slavery. And so they would have to learn how to find that security and assurance in Yahweh. But in order to do that, they had to go where they would have to experience the momentary terror of what we might call free falling. But it is only in the free falling that we experience being caught by God. For many of us, the hardest part of taking this step into practicing Sabbath is that it means walking into the wilderness. It means going into the unknown, going into that place without all of the security and assurances that we are accustomed to and experiencing a bit of free falling. As soon as we talk about taking a day off, to stop, to rest, to delight, and to worship, immediately are flooded with all of the what ifs. What if I don't finish this project? What if I don't get all the emails responded to? What if I don't get this taken care of? What if I don't do this? And where we're going to is we're going back to Egypt, where we are enslaved by those securities and assurances that we have grown used to. But it's also where we stay in bondage. I want to go back to the passage that Jonathan read at the beginning. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you are one of these Israelites who have seen God do these miraculous things, of sending these plagues, one plague after the next. And finally, Pharaoh has said, just go, just leave. And then, as Israel takes flight, as they leave, Pharaoh realizes what he has done. And I want to walk through this passage and imagine yourself as one of these Israelites in this moment. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people and said, what have we done? Why have we released Israel from serving us? So he got his chariot ready and took his troops with him. He took 600 of the best chariots and all the rest of the chariots of Egypt, with officers in each one. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites, who were going out defiantly. Israel was going out in confidence. They had said, yes, God has set us free. We are going out confidently. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them and caught up with them as they camped by the sea. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Israel is beginning to feel the free falling. We trusted you, God, and here we are about to die. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this why we told you in Egypt, leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. It's amazing how quickly their tone changes. Right? God comes down in the first place because he has heard the cries of his people, the cries of their affliction under this bondage in Egypt. But as soon as danger comes, as soon as they're under threat, as soon as their security seems to be gone, they're saying, it's better for us to go back to Egypt. It would be better for us there. And this is what we experience when we say, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to take a step. And the floor seems to fall out from under us. We're like, let's go back to where it was secure. But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet. The Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. We don't get Moses' reaction here, but if I were Moses, I'd be thinking, what, are you serious? What are you talking about? The sea is going to part. But these are the kinds of things that happen when you allow yourself to step out into free falling and God catch you. It's things that God can do outside of our imagination of what God would ever do begin to happen. And you experience God catching you and you see him fighting for you. And so he says, as for me, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Not only is God going to rescue Israel, but he is going to defeat Egypt in the process. The very things that they are in terror of, God is going to defeat. Verse 19, then the angel of the Lord, who was going in front of the Israelites' forces, moved and went behind them. When Israel was coming out of Egypt, God showed up in a pillar of fire that he led them through during the night. They just followed this pillar of fire. And then in the day, God manifests himself as a cloud that they followed. But when Egypt comes out after them, God moves from in front of them to behind them so that the Egyptians cannot see them. It says the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. God protects his people in ways that they could not have anticipated. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove back the sea with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the water like a wall to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and all went into the sea after them. God's incredible plan of rescue is unfolding. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. These are the things that God does when you step out into the unknown. He shows up and works in ways that you cannot have anticipated. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back on the Egyptians, on their chariots and horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. The water came back and covered the chariots and horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Not even one of them survived. But the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him. They had stepped out into the unknown. They'd experienced free falling, and they experienced the incredible power of God catching them. Now let me ask you, if you were the Israelites, would you have rather stayed in Egypt, continued making bricks 7 days a week without rest, but not had to go through this momentary terror? Or would you have gone through the momentary terror to have seen this miraculous provision of God so that you could now say, you know what? I don't know what God's plan is. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know I've seen him part seas. I've seen him throw armies into confusion, make their chariots swerve. I've seen God. I've seen what it looks like for him to fight on my behalf. And so I know whatever comes, God's going to step into that and be my provision in a way that I don't have to be my own provision anymore. And so I'm going to trust if God is inviting me, nay, commanding me to take a day of Sabbath, I'm going to trust that he's going to take care of me. He's going to take care of the universe that I think I have to keep spinning. He's going to take care of that so I can experience what it's like for God to catch me for 24 hours. And so I don't know what your questions are, what your but what abouts are, of why Sabbath seems impossible, why we can't do it, why we can't reorient our lives entirely around God. But I guarantee if you are willing to take that step into the unknown, that's the only place you're going to experience God catching you. Because you can't be oriented around Pharaoh and Yahweh at the same time. It's one or the other. So I want to invite you to take a moment to close your eyes and to say, God, help me to see what is the orienting factor of my life that I run back to again and again. What is the thing that I have oriented my life around, God, that I have depended on? God, that I have worshiped in place of you. And in spite of time and time again, being run over by it, being exhausted by it, being beat down by it, I keep going back to it. God, would you help us to be free of these false gods this morning? Would you help us to see, God, that what we have oriented our life around is not taking us where we think it's going to take us? God, in your kindness and your gentleness, would you draw us back to yourself? May we be open again to a taste of heaven. God, that in your presence we would find rest, we would find delight. And God, in that delight, we would enjoy the gift that it is to worship you. God, would you come and begin to part some waters? God, as we've trusted you to step into the unknown, would you begin to show a little bit of your faithfulness this morning? Because, God, the only place we're going to experience your incredible faithfulness is when we let go of all the things we've oriented our lives around and trust in you.